We have come, at long last, to the end of Nintendo Power's 4th year. We're right in time for the start of 2016. This week, we have issue 36 from May of 1992 and the results of the 4th annual Nestor Awards. I'm looking forward to those just as much as you are, so let's get started. Our cover game this issue is Darkwing Duck. This is drawn art, done less like a still from the show and more like comic book art, with hash mark gradient shading underneath Darkwing's cape to give the impression of shadows. Still, the art does show how much Darkwing was influenced visually by the Shadow, with a dark overcoat, though purple instead of black, and a cape with a lighter shade liner, though the Shadow was black with a red liner, Darkwing is purple and violet, and with a slouch hat. Other than that, the Shadow has a big red scarf with his big nose sticking out over the top, while that costume style doesn't work as well for, a duck, so Darkwing instead wears a Zorro mask. As you can clearly see. I bring all this up because it kind of makes, looking at Darkwing Duck again, after having read a bunch of the Shadow stuff and seen some cover art by Bill Sienkiewicz and Jim Steranko of the Shadow, I kind of want to see, art of Darkwing Duck by Steranko and Sienkiewicz, or done in their styles. That'd be kind of neat to see. Our letters theme this issue is for what video game characters readers would like to be for a day. And unfortunately, none of these letters really stand out. It's fairly basic stuff, and we don't have any art submissions this time, really, so we can't talk about those either, which is kind of a bummer. Our cover game is our first game we're getting to this issue as well, since it's an NES title. Darkwing Duck is another Capcom title, and like DuckTales, or for that matter, the Mega Man games, you can take on the stages in almost any order. It's kind of in blocks of 3. We get something of a recommended level order, and maps of most of the stages prior to the final stage of Foul Headquarters. Darkwing Duck plays a lot like Mega Man, complete with some similar enemies. There are even enemies that work exactly like Sniper Joe's, blocking your shots with a cape as opposed to a riot shield, and being open to damage only when they fire. However, there are a few very distinct and significant differences. First, while you have a smaller life bar, you are able to block shots yourself by pressing up on the D-pad to raise your cape. This won't block all attacks, but it gives you an added defensive move to your vocabulary that you didn't have in the Mega Man games. Second, rather than taking a boss's weapon when you beat them, you pick up power-ups to your gas gun that vary your shots over the course of the level. This means that there isn't really any significant order in which to take levels aside from the general difficulty of the level in particular and your own skill level. The game also handles platforming a little differently by enabling Darkwing to grab onto some ledges and jump up and down through them. Some levels also require you to grab onto objects in the environment like hooks or pulleys in order to proceed. In theory, this could change up the platforming in a fun way. In practice, the platforming is very finicky when you're trying to grab onto these objects. This means you can end up missing a lot of jumps for reasons that really aren't clear, causing a whole bunch of cheap deaths. It's still a fun game, but these issues are definitely something to keep in mind. Next, we have a platformer based on the Hanna-Barbera Wacky Races cartoon, where you're playing as Muttley. I think this is the first game we've gotten where you are overtly playing as the villain of the licensed work. Also, this is kind of a stylistic shift from the original work, in that this isn't a racing game in any form, whether in the form of isometric games like RC Pro-Am, behind-the-back rally games like Rad Racer, or vehicular platformers like City Connection. Wacky Races is a decent platformer, but that's pretty much all I can say for it. Aside from mapping the bosses onto protagonist racers from the cartoon shorts and having the protagonists of the game be the antagonists of the show, as opposed to, say, Roger Ramjet or Penelope Pitstop, this game is pretty average. Controls are decent, the level design, though, just generally falls into your bog-standard game level designs. Forest stage and plain stage, desert stage with an Egyptian motif, and so on. It feels like kind of a reskin of a Japanese platformer, just redone with the characters from Wacky Races. The third and final film Robocop film of the Nintendo Power era is out, and it has a licensed title as well. Once again from Ocean, and it appears to, from the article, play pretty much the same way as the last two titles, and we get maps of the first 4 stages. I'm calling it now. There have never been any good Robocop games. There never were in the past, there will not be in the future. I may be proven wrong when we get to Robocop versus the Terminator, but until we get to that point, I'm not seeing any good Robocop games at all. This game just feels like Ocean isn't trying. Like they just took their crappy ZX Spectrum Robocop 3 game, put a fresh coat of paint on it, and called it good. It's the same engine as the earlier Robocop games. They just kind of upped your jump a little bit. And it's just bland and bad and boring and a little too difficult for its own good. I'd be disappointed, but that would imply that I had expectations for Ocean titles, and this game in particular, and I have none. In the classified information column, we have a strategy to help you get some quick cash in Legend of the Mystical Ninja. In the Legend of Zelda comic, Link has acquired the Master Sword and now goes on to take on Aghanim. We previously covered the NES version of Batman Return of the Joker. Now the game has gotten a Game Boy port, and let's see if it works a little better than the earlier version. This game is a massive exercise in frustration. This game wants to have the gameplay style of the original Sunsoft Batman game for the NES, except on the Game Boy, but it can't quite pull it off. The game gives you batarangs as a projectile weapon, and lets you shoot your bat line at a 45-degree angle so you can swing across gaps, and brings the triangle jump from the NES game into this title. But it doesn't quite make things work. The game doesn't give you lives, just a group of continues, which is fairly poor design from a difficulty management standpoint. Most other games, they let you get lives after a certain number of points, or have extra lives available in the environment. However, continues and getting those doesn't quite work the same way. And you also have the multiplier effect with continues with most other games, where with 4 lives plus 5 continues, it effectively gives you 20 chances before you have to start over from the beginning. This doesn't really give you that. Second, the game makes water an even greater hazard for Batman than it is for the Belmont clan. Touching water at any point in the game causes you to take damage, and there are levels with changing water heights that you have to pay heed to over the course of the game. That said, this game does do some things very, very well. The graphics are really quite good, particularly the visual flourishes with the parts of the level environment that are immersed in water, the ripple effect. Additionally, the game gets the balance between large expansive levels and sprites with character right. There are big levels, and you scroll through them vertically and horizontally, and your character sprite for Batman is big enough to have character and his movements and animations and how his cape moves and everything else, while also being small enough that you can have enough distance in the environment to give you an idea of where you need to go next and help you plan your next moves. If the game didn't have water be as much of a hazard, or for that matter, a hazard at all, and fix the lives problem, this game would be absolutely perfect. Next up is Fun Pack 4-in-1, which is a collection of 4 games. Chess, checkers, backgammon, and reversey. This is a collection of 4 board games, and honestly, I'm going to say this is not actually worth reviewing, as you're either interested in playing these games electronically, or you aren't. And these 4 games are some of the most frequently worked on titles when it comes to experimenting on AI and random number generation. So, this is a situation where generally these games are probably going to play fairly well. Speaking of titles I'm not going to review, next up is the Workboy, which is an app suite, and which also has a keyboard attachment for your Game Boy. This would be interesting to review from a hardware standpoint, sort of like the Lazy Game Review's Oddware reviews, but I don't have the hardware to do this review, so I'm going to give this a miss. That said, if somebody has done a Oddware style review of the Workboy and its keyboard and all that, please let me know and post in the comments. I'd be interested in watching that. Next, we began our results for the Nestor Rewards. I've only covered a couple games this far, so I should be able to get a bit more depth here and still have time for that. First up, in the graphics and sound category, our winners are Battletoads on the NES, Metroid 2 on the Game Boy, and Super Mario World on the SNES. I buy the Game Boy and Super Nintendo picks, but I was not particularly impressed with Battletoads, with the exception of the super fast scrolling during the jet bike sequences. In the theme and fun category, our winners are Battletoads on the NES, Mega Man on the Game Boy, and once again Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo. I can dig the Super Nintendo pick, and actually the NES pick on this one, but not so much on the Game Boy pick due to the issues which I discussed in my review with the scaling of the sprites compared to the screen size. For Best Challenge, the winners are Ninja Gaiden 3 on the NES, Metroid 2 on the Game Boy, and Super Ghouls and Ghosts on the Super Nintendo. I think the winners on all three systems are definitely worthy. For Best Play Control, the winners are Battletoads on the NES, Metroid 2 on the Game Boy, and Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo. Once again, I don't have much to argue about in this one either. For Best Simultaneous Multiplayer, the winner is Battletoads on the NES, and I have to disagree strongly on this one. Due to the ability to damage your fellow player, particularly on the swinging stages, this game is very difficult and impossible to complete in multiplayer. For Best Villain, the winner is Bowser, and I can't really disagree here. As of the listed villains, he's got the most longevity in terms of game franchises. It's not like he's beating Kefka or anything on the list where the sheer quality of the villain outweighs the quantity of their body of work. For Most Innovative Game, Final Fantasy II wins, and I buy this. This is the most strongly narratively focused game on a Nintendo console to date, both in terms of quality and quantity of the game's narrative. Before this, game narrative was basically predominantly told through out-of-engine cutscenes like the Ninja Gaiden games. Here, the story is kept in-engine and is very involved and intricate with a lot of things being discussed here with characters agonizing decisions and making choices, as opposed to the relative blank slates of your party in the first Final Fantasy game on the NES. Finally, we get to our winners for each console. Best NES game winner is Battletoads, which I disagree with, but I understand. The Toads were cashing in on the same wave of hype that brought us Turtle Mania. For Best Game Boy game, we have Metroid 2, and this is a very solid game and an excellent continuation of the series, and is definitely worthy of the win. For Best Super Nintendo game, we have Super Mario World, which is unquestionably a solid pick, particularly since a lot of players are split on this and Super Mario Bros. 3 as being the best Mario game. Moving on to the comics, in Super Mario Adventure, Princess Peach has escaped, and now Mario has been captured, which means Luigi and Peach have to step up to save Mario himself.